Yeah, I know you saw the movie. I know you went and watched all those 300 buff dudes absolutely slaughter legions of Persians. And yes, it was awesome. Back when movies didn't suck. Movies suck now, so there's no reason to consume any of the media garbage that is being forced upon us. Doesn't that just annoy the crap out of you? The fact that we used to have amazing movies with unbelievable amounts of creativity, and now it's all gone just so we can placate an unbelievably corrupt guy. Alright, yeah, okay. Anyway, we're not going to discuss that. Instead, what I want to do is I want to discuss the possibility that the Battle of Thermopylae, which took place around 480 BC or so, according to the mainstream, may not have actually taken place. Or at least not as mainstream historians currently claim. Now, at first glance, this might sound a little schizo, because at the beginning of my introduction, I literally said that the battle may not have taken place at all. And that is going to be our claim for this show. Now, I get it. The claim sounds schizo, because obviously, all of these historians believe that this battle took place exactly how it's recorded in history, so it must be a real battle. That is literally the logic that mainstream historians take, because all the other authorities believe it's real, it must be real. I mean, look at all of their shiny degrees, and they all go to these expensive colleges, and they all regurgitate the exact same story. So that must mean it is a fact, right? I mean, there's no way any of these historians could have gotten something like this so incredibly wrong, right? I mean, there's no possible way. All of these people have done so much research, and they have so much evidence to support the claim that the Battle of Thermopylae took place, that there is no reason to question this concept at all. Now, I beg to differ, because that is not how we do history, and it is certainly not how we approach science. Before we get into this subject, and it is a fascinating subject, we need to ask the question, why am I wasting our time looking at the Battle of 300? I mean, what the hell does this have to do with anything that really matters in history? I mean, yes, apparently the Battle of the 300 would have been a historical event, but how much of the world did that really change? I mean, did that do something megalithic that, changed all of history forever and all this stuff? And you could argue that this story, maybe did change some stuff in history, but the reality is the battle is basically 300 dudes who get steamrolled by an incredibly huge army. They still lose, right? Maybe, they hold the army back for a second, but in the grand scheme of things, unfortunately, it really technically doesn't matter, because the Persians still won the battle. And history continued on without them, quite well enough, by the way. So, if the battle ultimately did not matter in the grand scheme of history, why did it ultimately become so remembered and ultimately seriously revered within the historical community? And the reason why is simple. It's simply an attractive story or an attractive tale that you can tell your students or that you can think about. For example, the movie based on the events of Thermopylae was not made so that everybody could sit there and learn real history. The reality is that it was a very intriguing tale, and it was a tale you could play with and make it seem really cool and entertain people with. That was the only real reason why the movie was made at all, simply because it's an attractive story. And that remains true even with respect to real historians. The story itself is heroic, it's endearing, and it has total sacrifice at the end. The reality is, this particular battle really does play out almost as if it was a legitimate work of fiction designed to be interesting. It's almost as if somebody simply created this story and inserted it into ancient Greek history. Alright, so let's set the foundation of what we are going to talk about today, and then we'll start to dig into the possibility that the event that we right now know as the Battle of Thermopylae may never have occurred in history, or if it did occur, it did not take place in 480 BC, but potentially during the 1200s AD. So, first, let's see what the mainstream considers the Battle of Thermopylae. So I'll just read off of this bastion of truth, Wikipedia. Let's see what these people generally believe, and then we will go from there, because there's a really good chance that this is going to represent the vast majority of historians. Now, I realize that there are other fringe historians that are already questioning this situation or have a completely different outlook on it, and I get it, I'm acknowledging you people. But at the end of the day, we are just going to be trashing the mainstream perspective, because that's generally what everybody is going to be familiar with. Alright, so this is what Wikipedia says about the Battle of Thermopylae. Thermopylae. You like that? Thermopylae. Thermopylae. Alright, anyway. The Battle of Thermopylae took place during the Second Persian invasion of Greece, occurring in July, August, or September 4080 BC. It was one of the most prominent military engagements of the Greco-Persian Wars. Seeking to halt the Persian army's offensive into Greece, an alliance of Greek city-states was led by Sparta to block off Thermopylae. After 3 days of fighting, the Spartan king Leonidas I was killed, and the rest of the Greeks were outflanked and annihilated, enabling the Achaemenid Empire to take control of Phocis, Boeotia, and Attica. See, this event really does have all the great tellings of a good fictional story. You have a good, mighty king going out to save his people, and this is all portrayed in the movie as well, for example, right? And they play to it hugely, because this particular story really does have a psychological grab on your average person. If you look at it from a story perspective, it really does have all the good makings of a good story. Right, you have the king going out to save his people. They're the underdogs. There's the huge evil army bearing down on the kingdom. And then, of course, the heroic sacrifice at the end. It's all a very, very interesting piece of work. Now, that does not mean that something like this could not have happened in real life. I completely acknowledge that. I just wanted to point out that the way this battle is told, though, is very much told in a entertaining kind of way. And that's something to keep in mind as we start to go through this, because that might actually be more true than historians are willing to believe. Alright, so where did this story even come from? I mean, why do we even have a recollection of this story anyways? If the battle took place in 480 BC, that's a long time ago, right? That's like, what, 2,400 years ago or whatever? Yeah, I can do a little math. Shut up. A couple of millennia is going to matter when we are trying to understand what happened in the past. And this is a huge sore point with respect to real history, and of course chronology as well, because the further things go back, the harder it is to prove that they existed. So where did this story come from? Let's once again just read the little Wikipedia section that should give us a general level foundation for us to chew into as we start to dissect what may have actually happened with respect to this story. The primary source for the Greco-Persian Wars is the Greek historian Herodotus. The Sicilian historian Diodorus Siculus, I don't know how to pronounce these. I suck at reading, you know that. The Sicilian historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC in his Bibliotheca Historica, also provides an account of the Greco-Persian Wars, partially derived from the earlier Greek historian Ephorus. Diodorus is fairly consistent with Herodotus's writings. These wars are also described in less detail by a number of other ancient historians, including Plutarch, Cessaeus of Cnidus, and are referred to by other authors, as by Aeschylus in the Persians. Archaeological evidence, such as the Serpent Column, now in the Hippodrome of Constantinople, also supports some of Herodotus's specific reports. George B. Grundy was the first modern historian to do a thorough topographical survey of Thermopylae, and led some modern writers to revise their views of certain aspects of the battle. Grundy also explored the plateau and wrote a treatise on the battle. On the Battle of Thermopylae itself, two principal sources, Herodotus and Simonides, accounts survive. So we have two accounts. Okay, we'll get to that. Herodotus' account in Book 7 of his histories is such an important source that Paul Cartledge wrote, "We either write a history of Thermopylae with Herodotus or not at all." Yeah, that's saying something. All right. Also surviving is an epitome of the account of Cisseus by the 8th century Byzantine Photios, though this is almost worse than useless. Missing key events in the battle, such as the betrayal of Ephialtes and the account of Diodorus Siculus in his Universal History. Diodorus's account seems to have been based on that of Ephorus and contains one significant deviation from Herodotus's account, a supposed night attack against the Persian camp, of which modern scholars have tended to be skeptical. So that's the Wikipedia entry on the sources from which mainstream historians end up basing their entire worldview on when it comes to the Battle of Thermopylae. I mean, literally reading those 3 paragraphs, you can already immediately, scientifically see that there are incredible problems with the records of this event. So it really does beg the question, why do mainstream historians teach this battle or teach this event in history as if it is a solid scientific fact, when we literally only have a few accounts from ancient authors whose accounts even of themselves are being sourced on questionable material? This is literally how mainstream history makes the case for the Battle of Thermopylae that took place back in 480 BC. Now, does anybody see a problem with that? I mean, does anybody immediately, hopefully you immediately found a problem with everything I just read, but we find ourselves in a situation to where mainstream historians are using some of the most ridiculous sources you could imagine, and they are beyond not scientific, to make the claim that a very particular point in history took place. If I were to go to a mainstream institution right now and start seriously questioning the Battle of Thermopylae, and even go so far as simply saying it doesn't exist, your evidence does not prove that the battle exists, I would be immediately kicked out. If I was part of that class, I'd fail it. The professor wouldn't even listen to me because mainstream history already has everything figured out and you're not allowed to go against it. This is why it's funny to read Wikipedia. You go to these sites and you get a general idea about what the mainstream is thinking and what the mainstream builds their ideologies on, and it's some of the most flimsy evidence you could possibly imagine. And this is what we are supposed to believe. Otherwise, we're a crazy conspiracy theorist or schizo or whatever else they're going to call us nowadays. You're not allowed to question this. Well, this is funny. Right here in the Wikipedia article, there really should have been a warning right at the top of the page that says this is only a possible battle. we do not possess the actual real evidence to prove that this event actually took place. We don't have it. It should say that. It does not. The way this stuff comes off is that, yes, it happened, and we basically know it happened for sure. I mean, ignore the fact that we don't have enough evidence to really support it, but, you know, we do have a couple of stories from supposedly ancient Greece that corroborates what we believe should be real, so of course it's going to be real. I mean, this is literally what they are doing. All right, so right there, even at the beginning, before we have even started diving into the details, even on the mainstream websites, you can immediately call into question the existence of this battle. Now, before we start getting into the, I guess, the science or the history of what's going on here, and maybe come out with a different outcome, why is this important and why am I even talking about this? The reason why I want to cover this is not just because we can call into question a historical event and maybe disprove it. That's something in and of its own right. But the main thing that we will get out of this is a step forward with respect to understanding real chronology. Because one of the problems that we have in mainstream history is that, you know, the mainstream has this entire timeline all blocked out, you know, they've got it all figured out, and every bit of work that anybody does nowadays has to relate to that mainstream timeline. The Battle of Thermopylae would give mainstream historians a potential anchor within the mainstream chronology so that they could anchor other historical events to it so that they could then use something like the Battle of Thermopylae to support the existence of other historical events. All right? So basically what mainstream has done, and what they continue to do with everything, is they base all of their current theories or their current historical narratives on some unbelievably flimsy foundations, or literally foundations that are built of nothing but lies and made up information. And that's what we have going on here. So if we can disprove that the Battle of Thermopylae took place in 480 BC, and then prove that something else happened much later, then that means we get a step closer into understanding and creating a real historical chronology, because that is really what we need right now. All the stuff that I talk about on this channel, I know if you go to like the videos and you see all the different stuff that I cover, I know it all sounds schizo and it all sounds disjointed and maybe not necessarily, you know, a cohesive, but the reality is everything that I bring up on this channel actually is one big picture of our true history. So if we can eliminate a potential historical date that is inaccurate or an event that never happened, that goes to great lengths to proving the chronology of other events that may not necessarily seem related. Stuff like, you know, catastrophism and things like that, right? Nobody really thinks about the Battle of Thermopylae when they think about the Venus event. Nobody's really doing that, but this all matters, because one of the problems that we face as historians is that we still do not have a good grasp of when events truly took place with respect to chronology. So right now, you know, the mainstream has their whole spiel that they, you know, their song and dance that they do, and they have it all figured out, but it takes very little scientific scrutiny or just basic critical thinking scrutiny to really destroy a lot of the fabric of the mainstream chronology. So if we find ourselves in a position to where other researchers are using the mainstream chronology to date catastrophic events, but if the mainstream chronology is fundamentally incorrect, that means all the science that is being worked on right now with respect to catastrophism is going to not be as accurate as it really should be, because they're using a chronology that is inherently wrong. So just as a side example, and we'll get to the Battle of Thermopylae. For example, you know, the Venus event, if it took place, and it certainly seems like it did, we have the science for that, but right now the mainstream chronology would place it around the 1500s BC. Now, what happens if we can prove that 1500 BC did not exist in the sense of 1500 BC simply because at some point in time, mainstream chronologists added, say, upwards of 1,000 years, perhaps 1,800 years to the mainstream chronology. And then if catastrophists are using all of these padded dates for their scientific reasoning, that immediately puts a lot of the work that people are doing right now on shaky ground. So that's why I believe it's extraordinarily important that even while we are studying things like plasma physics, electric universe, etc., we still have to focus on getting the chronology correct, because that is going to matter not just from a historical perspective, but also from a scientific perspective. Because dates and time lengths of events, that stuff is all going to matter, right? Okay, so that's why it's going to be important to, if we can, to eliminate dates of events that never took place. So let's do that with the 300 Battle of Thermopylae. I know, we're finally getting to it. What I want to do today is I want to actually read a small snippet from a book called Redating Ancient Greece. 500 BC equals 1800 AD. The premise of this book is exactly what the title says. Basically, is it possible that mainstream historians and their chronology are completely wrong? And I don't mean by a few weeks or a few years. Is it possible that mainstream historians that have dated ancient Greece to the 500 BC period have completely misdated this civilization? Is it possible that they have misdated ancient Greece by 1800 years? That's the claim that we are going to be working on. Now, I get it if right now you think that's total crazy schizo stuff, because obviously mainstream historians make the claim that ancient Greece, obviously was, 2,000 plus years ago, and everybody knows this, and we know everything about ancient Greece. So how the hell can you make a claim like this? How is this even possible? It's very simple. If we follow the scientific evidence and we examine the historical evidence with an objective, critical thinking eye, suddenly all of the stuff, all of these histories that mainstream teaches as established fact suddenly starts to fall apart. This is what is going on when we look at ancient Greece. The more we look at all the stuff that mainstream historians believe they have a grasp on, the more we put these claims to the scientific test and an objective historical test, a lot of their stuff immediately begins to fall apart. Even in that 3-paragraph little spiel I read from Wikipedia talking about where did the source come from this particular event, the sources are scarce at best. Right, for example, Herodotus is one of the major sources. There's a lot of problems with Herodotus, and we'll have to do a show on him later because it's a fascinating situation. That whole thing is crazy, right? But if people are going to be quoting Herodotus and Herodotus's works are not correct, accurate, or outright false, or all kinds of stuff, there's a lot of problems with that. What kind of situation does that put us in? Right, that screws us over big time, and that absolutely destroys any kind of a claim that anybody could have if they were basing their claim on anything from Herodotus. Now, another thing, I have read from this book a few other times on this YouTube channel, whatever the hell this is, this garbage channel. And one of the things that we have discovered with respect to the 1800-year phantom years that have been added to the chronology is that if we get rid of 1800 years in the chronology, what happens is that Hellenistic Greece, or ancient Greece, suddenly comes up closer to us and is now existing between the 1200s and the 1600s AD. Now, Herodotus will actually be a very interesting benchmark on his own. And by that I mean a chronological benchmark. Because if we are going to delete 1800 years from mainstream chronology, that puts Herodotus not in the 400s BC, but that puts him square in the 1400s BC. Crazy, right? Absolutely insane. We think of Herodotus as an ancient Greek historian, But what if whoever Herodotus was, and remember, there is all kinds of problems with that dude. And I'm not the only one that says that, by the way. That's even a mainstream situation. Herodotus is a whole other problem with respect to history and chronology. But at the very least, his existence in the sense that he exists right now in the mainstream chronology, that really is an interesting situation when we get rid of 1800 years. That means that he was a scholar or a historian or whatever you want to call him during the Renaissance period, right? He would have been operating amongst all kinds of other people who we consider Renaissance authors, philosophers, etc. Even more interesting, that little 3-paragraph spiel that I read that, tells all the sources. There are people in there that are also citing Herodotus. Another thing that we have discovered with all of those Greek authors that cite Herodotus is that they as well would have existed either at the same time as Herodotus in the 1400s AD, time frame, or a little later. Or those authors could legitimately be fictitious. It is entirely possible that some of the authors that I just read off in that little, recap there never existed at all, and it was somebody else just writing under that name to create phantom time to fill in the gaps that chronologists had created during the Renaissance period. This is a legitimate problem that we are facing right now in history, and I get it. It sounds schizo, it sounds absolutely insane, because how could mainstream chronologists, or more to the point, historians, how could mainstream historians make such a huge mistake? I mean, wouldn't people in academia have called out the other academics? And then, of course, real science and real history would have taken place, and the truth would have come out? Of course not. Remember, academia is 100% corrupt, and by that I mean mainstream academia, right? Those guys are gone psychologically. They have their narrative that they will die defending, and they are not going to change anything, regardless of how much information we bring to them. Now, on the flip side of things, there are a lot of people that do know about this. If you've never heard about it before, I'm not surprised, because this is not exactly being publicized everywhere, because, then everybody in academia, they would lose their jobs potentially and blah, blah. Anyway, nobody wants to lose their job. Everybody wants to support the narrative. And of course, if they're good boys and girls doing that, they get financial rewards for doing as such, all right? Since being a historian or a chronologist should really net you $0, because we should just be looking for the truth, we have nothing to gain but the truth. So when we look at this situation, I highly recommend not immediately just throwing it to the side, simply because it goes against what you have been trained classically to believe. You know for a fact that there are indeed problems with respect to our understanding of history. You may not have realized that there was this big of a problem, but this is what shows up. And by the way, remember, all of this is based on real history that we have. Remember, we don't have a ton of that either, but it's also based on science. So when we find a situation to where mainstream historians have their ears and eyes closed to any new kind of information which may potentially change the paradigm, that's your clue that something is going wrong. And I guarantee you, every single one of you have probably had that moment, or 2 or 10 or a million, as you have started to research history. All right, that stuff is everywhere. There are not going to be any paradigm shifts in the mainstream. So it is up to us outside of the mainstream to do this, all right? So don't be afraid to ignore mainstream people, by the way. We don't have to convince these guys of anything. Who cares what they think? If they're going to believe in lies and stupid crap, let them go. They're literally not worth our time. Okay, let's get to the reading. All right, so this section is called
Two Famous Battles, or Twice the Same Battle.
Let us now study 2 historical battles which were fought very close to each other on a Greek map, but at 2 very different times in the Scaligerian version of Greek history. Now remember, Joseph Scaliger is the guy who essentially created all of the chronology that mainstream uses now. Or I shouldn't say all of it. He was the one that built the foundation of the chronology that is used now. So if you hear Scaliger, that's who Scaliger is. Basically, Scaliger was a fraud, but of course, all of mainstream history is built on top of what this guy created and pulled out of his butt. Okay. The Battle of Thermopylae. The Battle of Thermopylae was one of the most famous battles to unfold on the soil of ancient Greece. It is so famous and emblematic in European history that in 1962, Hollywood released a dramatic peplum about the battle entitled The 300 Spartans. Sparta, or Lacedaemon, was the dominant military city-state in ancient Greece. Sparta was located in the southern part of the Peloponnese and was renowned for its fearless warriors. In 2006, the fantasy war film named 300 was also based on the illustrious battle. More generally speaking, the Battle of Thermopylae has become a timeless, iconic symbol of bravery and resistance in Greek psyches and indeed in all Western culture. Remember, like I said, this story really does have all the makings to be a fantastic fictional adventure war story. That's kind of what we got. The battle opposed Greece to Persia, with King Leonidas of Sparta on the Greek side, along with a few thousand men, and King Xerxes I on the other side, accompanied with almost 2 million soldiers, according to Herodotus. Damn, 2 million? Jeez. More realistically, it is thought that the Persians counted between 70,000 and 250,000 men. Although the Greeks did not win in the end, the Battle of Thermopylae had become a mythical example of Spartan courage, as the vastly outnumbered Greeks managed to resist the enemy for 3 days in what remains one of the most celebrated against all odds last stands of history. The fight is supposed to have occurred in the year 480 BC, right during classical Greece. Really quick, this next section that we are going to go through is going to set the stage for what could possibly have been the original battle that the 300 battle was eventually created or based on and then thrown way back into the past.
The Battle of Neopatris.
The Battle of Neopatris took place only about 15 miles away from the presumed location of the Battle of Thermopylae. Yeah, don't forget, by the way, we don't even have guaranteed the true location about where the 300 stood ground. We don't have that. Like, there's no actual scientific proof that corroborates the geophysical location where this took place. Like, it's very, you would think that we would have that. We do not. All right. The exact year of the battle is not known, but it is generally assumed that it took place in the 1270s AD, perhaps in 1272 AD or 1275 AD, and that would be the Battle of Neopatris. The belligerents were John I Ducas, ruler of Thessaly in Greece, and John Ducas Palaiologos, commander-in-chief of the Byzantine army. The Byzantines tried to besiege the city of Neopatris, but were severely defeated by the Thessalians, who were far fewer in number but much more organized. One very interesting aspect of the battle is that of John I Ducas, who was helped by John de la Roche, the Frankish Duke of Athens, who offered 300 horsemen to free Neopatris, and who played a decisive role to win the battle. This, of course, reminds us of the 300 Spartans in the previous battle. There were 30,000 soldiers or so on the opposing side, or about 100 times more. Another interesting aspect of the battle is this. At the site of the huge Byzantine encampment, John de la Roche is supposed to have decided to quote, in Greek, Herodotus's phrase, quote, "Among so many people, there were so few real men," unquote. These events occurred some 1,755 years after the Battle of Thermopylae. Don't forget, that 1800-ish year number is going to be the key to understanding and fixing chronology. And don't forget also that it's not an exact 1800 years, it's around 1800 years. So if anybody wants to start crap with that and saying, well, I mean, technically, bro, it's like 1755 or 1755 years ago, not 1800. You know, shut up. That's like semantics. Don't you start with me on that. I swear to God. 1800-ish years. Because remember, we really don't have, even the mainstream does not have any kind of true accurate dating when it comes to any of this kind of stuff. Like all of the dates that have been essentially imagined by mainstream, I mean, that's what they are. They're not accurate. People back in ancient Greece, they were not writing in the AD, BC kind of chronology. That format literally did not exist. So when historians try to place dates on a lot of this stuff, it's really important to remember that even the dates that the mainstream has come to, I mean, they're shaky at best, but at worst, or in reality, they're not real, because we have no true way of dating these things, especially 2,000 plus years ago. Are you crazy? The fact that anybody thinks that they can do that just makes me want to go over and start choking someone. Just This next section is called
One and the same battle?
Are these two battles one and the same? True, the names of people and origins look obviously different, but the core story is virtually the same, and on closer inspection, we discover additional curious parallels. Really fast, just to clarify something. So when we start to look at this 1800-year time gap and we start to try to make some correlation between an event that supposedly took place during Hellenistic Greece, you know, that era between 300 and 500-ish BC, and maybe a little outside of that range. Anyways, when we are looking back at the Hellenistic period and then subtracting 1800-ish years from the chronology, that puts us square in the Renaissance kind of an era, right? We suddenly show up between 1200 and 1600 or so. Remember, these aren't like perfectly exact years. We don't really have that, but it's around that area. Anyway, something to keep in mind really fast, and I don't know if I mentioned it at the beginning of this video. I was kind of assuming that people had watched the other ones that laid out the groundwork for what we're talking about with respect to the 1800-year time gap situation. We have a situation to where essentially Renaissance chronologers who are attempting to create a full-blown, realistic chronology of all the events that have happened going back thousands and thousands of years. What these guys ended up doing was creating all kinds of imaginary time periods. Or as they would create one event that they thought existed, suddenly they would find themselves in a position with, say, 500 extra years that they were going to have to fill with historical events. So one of the things that these guys did is they would take events that had happened either during their lifetime or was a very recent event within the past 100, maybe 200 years of them being alive. They would take an event that actually happened, basically copy and paste it, send that new event that they just created by copying and pasting backwards into the past so that they could now use that newly created event to fill in any gaps that had been created during the creation of what we now consider mainstream chronology. So these chronologists, really what happened is that they created all of these gaps that they had to fill. Now the reality is these chronologists generally were not of the creative psychology. They did not really have that creative intuition to really be imaginative and create all kinds of new crazy events that, nobody could technically prove, but would also differentiate them into the past. Instead of being original liars, what they did is they would just take an event that they knew had already happened recently, that they could be inspired by, or that they knew was at least potentially possible in real life, and they would take that event, change the names, change the date, and maybe change one or two or three little details, but otherwise the vast majority of the now made up story would retain all of the stuff from the original event that it was copying from. In my opinion, this was done because these chronologers had no imagination. So they would just copy paste something, throw it back in time and say, yes, this happened. Change a few names, that was easy enough. In some cases, they don't even do a good job changing the names, right? Like in this case, they didn't change the location of the battle, which is hilarious. They still kept it in the area of Thermopylae, right? They didn't even bother to change the geolocation. And there might be a couple other reasons for doing that as well, other than not being creative enough to make up something new. Anyway, when we read some of these sections, I know at first some of the connections are not going to seem obvious. So just give this author a second to paint the picture. And also remember that it's not always going to be a one-to-one copy, but it's going to be pretty damn close. And that's what's important to take away from this. All right, let's keep going. Are these two battles one and the same? True, the names of people and origins look obviously different, but the core story is virtually the same, and on closer inspection, we discover additional curious parallels. Yeah, I know, I just wanted to read that because I ended up talking a lot and I just wasted all of our time. Okay. One of the strangest aspects of the Battle of Neopatris is John de la Roche quoting Herodotus, perched on a height more than 17 centuries after the Greek historian had written down these lines. First of all, 1700 years is obviously a huge time interval. What's more, this is supposed to have happened 2 centuries before the first book was ever printed in Western Europe. And by the first book, that would be the first printed version of Herodotus in Western Europe. To top it all, the Frankish Duke is believed to have quoted Herodotus at a time when classical Greek authors had supposedly been forgotten by most Westerners for many centuries, and at a time when most people didn't read at all for the simple reason that printed books had yet to be invented. To quote Herodotus off the cuff in so appropriate a manner on the battlefield, John de la Roche certainly was a erudite war chief, and a very witty man for sure, unless the truth differs from the orthodox version. Even today, with the easy access to books of all kinds and the democratic use of the internet with Herodotus's The Histories online for everyone to read, you might find it slightly difficult to imagine that a war general would decide at some point during a battle to climb up a rocky spur and quote a 1700-year-old ancient author who wrote about a similar battle held in approximately the same place long before him. Of course, it is possible today. The only question is it plausible that such a thing occurred in 1275, 2 centuries before the invention of print and a millennium after the writings of Herodotus had been supposedly lost to Westerners? I love this because what this guy did here is that he's taking a simple quote said by, a man of the military, John de la Roche. And from that quote, we can actually potentially derive that there is a legitimate problem with recording this particular historical event. a lot of people would probably read this quote and move on and not think anything of it. They would just be like, yeah, I could see a war general quoting Herodotus for, I don't know, whatever reason, and they would move on. But this quote has extreme power with respect to chronology. Because why would this dude know about Herodotus? How could this dude have known about Herodotus? It's a very good historical question, and one that really does demand a scientific answer. If we use critical thinking and basic common sense, as this author is doing right here, when we find somebody mentioning a quote like this from written material that he probably would never have seen or even heard of, that is a problem. All right, let's keep going. Why are all the names different? One obvious difference in these two battles are the names of the main actors involved. King Leonidas and King Xerxes in the Battle of Thermopylae, John Ducas and John Ducas Palaeologos, and John de la Roche in the Battle of Neopatris. Completely different names in appearance. On closer inspection, though, things get slightly fuzzier. Let us look at the meaning of the protagonists' names in the Battle of Thermopylae. The name Leonidas means lion-like in Greek, while Xerxes in Persian means male hero among kings, or heroic king. Are these names real names, or rather nicknames, or vague descriptions of their function in the different languages of the later chroniclers, i.e., a lion-like war chief and a heroic king? These things get even stranger when we study the names of the participants of the Battle of Neopatris. First of all, by a funny coincidence, they were all named John. John Ducas, John Ducas Palaeologos. Two of them virtually bear the same full name, strangely enough, and John de la Roche. But is it really just a coincidence? This forename is said to derive from the Hebrew and literally means Jehovah has favored. One has to pose the following question. Was it really their forename, or was it more like a title that was being applied to them afterwards? The term ducas, also shared by the two belligerents, is a Greek word coming from the Latin dux, meaning leader or general, and designates a Byzantine nobleman, a general, or a ruler. A modern English equivalent is the term duke. One sees immediately that the word may not be a name in the modern sense of the term, but most probably, once again, some kind of title, as both men were war leaders or generals. And this is another really important point to remember. When you start to look at historical names, interestingly enough, a lot of the names that we think are legit names, they're not. They're actually titles applied to these characters because we don't actually know their real names. We give them, or not we, they were given nicknames by the chronologers, or they were given titles by the chronologers. And then, of course, those titles over the centuries then became the names of that particular historical figure. Just keep that in mind. And when you're studying your stuff, look at names, because a lot of the names right now that you might believe are actually names might actually just be a title. If it is indeed just a title, that opens the door to all kinds of stuff, because that means we don't know what we think we know. And that means that whoever recorded these events may know literally nothing about them as well. All right. As for the term Palaeologos, it is a Greek word literally meaning old word, and nobody knows how it came to apply to many Byzantine rulers in the Middle Ages. Does it mean that at some juncture chroniclers didn't understand the name because the word was too old? It's a good question. All things considered, there is now no contradiction in thinking that the lion-like king and the general favored by God were one and the same person, or that the heroic king and the general favored by God, old word, were also one and the same person. The language factor here might be the key. What about John de la Roche? If we didn't know that his name was already that of his grandfather, Othon de la Roche, the first Frankish lord of Athens in 1204, originally a Burgundian nobleman hailing from the castle of La Roche-sur-Aiguenon in what now is France, we would be tempted to say that John acquired his name de la Roche as a result of his comment about the Byzantine army, i.e. Herodotus's quotation, which he made on top of a rock after climbing a height. After all, the word roche means rock in French. And if I am mispronouncing that, yeah, I don't speak French. I'm not even, okay. If that's not how French people, say rock, my bad. Even the name of Herodotus himself is rather dubious, as the word Herodotus is Greek, literally means given granted to a hero, or given granted to a warrior. Interestingly, almost nothing is known about Herodotus's life. Is it possible that Herodotus's father, or perhaps Herodotus himself, was involved in the battle, and that the nickname was attributed to him on account of his bravery? Is John de la Roche Herodotus, or Herodotus's father? In this case, John wasn't quoting anyone. He was either making his own fresh comment or was quoting his father. That's insane to me. Isn't that amazing? Remember, like I said, and like you should know at this point in time, well, okay, I'm not going to be a douchebag, but Herodotus, we don't know anything about Herodotus. It's a guess. It is literal historical guesswork that he existed in the 400s BC. We have no scientific evidence, and we have basically no historical evidence either of his existence during that time. Remember, like I said, if we subtract the 1800 years from that period, Herodotus suddenly moves up into, say, the 1200s or the 1300s or the 1400s. And I have to be kind of vague with those numbers because the reality is we don't have, reliably accurate dates. But isn't that fascinating that Herodotus may have existed during this particular battle in the 12 to 1400s and then participated in it, right? It's just crazy. It changes everything that you think you know, but the evidence is what the evidence is. Now, if everything that you've heard so far sounds crazy, I understand, but don't forget, the only reason why any of this sounds crazy, and also the only reason why you've probably never heard about any of this, is simply because the mainstream historians will not allow any other kinds of interpretations. But the evidence is what it is. Like I said, you have to somehow get around all of this, and I guarantee you there is basically not a single mainstream historian that is focused on this as a problem at all, because the reality is they don't think there's a problem. They have it all locked down. There's no question that they are right. But hey, this evidence really shines a light onto everything that mainstream believes. We really do have to question everything that we are told, right? I don't know, let's keep going. I'm just rambling. Let us remind the listener that Herodotus wrote his most famous chronicle only 40 years after the Battle of Thermopylae, which we suspect is also the Battle of Neopatris. Unless these two battles represent two facets of a series of consecutive battles, one of which was sent back some 1755 years into the past, the other one remaining in its right time and slot. Whatever the truth, it seems hard to maintain that John de la Roche truly quoted a Greek historian living some 17 centuries before him. And I agree. It seems more reasonable to think that he said something which was shortly recorded afterwards by a historian we now call Herodotus, himself, his son, or someone who lived briefly after the Battle of Neopatris. Yeah, you didn't think we'd be redating Herodotus in this show either, did you? Well, it's done. It's over, son. This is how it goes now. All right. A counter-argument. One of the most obvious counter-arguments that may be raised to the one-battle theory is the fact that the forces opposing the Greeks in the two battles were different. Persians in the Battle of Thermopylae and Byzantines in the Battle of Neopatris. According to textbook history, Persia in 480 BC, which at the time was so-called Achaemenid Empire, occupied a far vaster territory than what it has occupied during most of its history, extending from the Indus Valley to what is now Turkey, the northernmost part of what is now Greece, and some of the islands of the Aegean Sea. The Byzantine Empire in 1275 AD was far smaller, according to what modern historians can reconstruct. And there's a whole problem with the Byzantine Empire and the way it interacts with Rome, and I'm not going to get into all that again. But also occupied much of what is now Turkey, the northernmost part of what is now Greece, and some of the islands of the Aegean Sea. So basically a very identical territory relative to the Persians. So, from a Greek point of view, the enemy came from exactly the same geographic area. It is only the name given to the enemy which differs. In the case of the Battle of Thermopylae, Greek chroniclers may have, at some point in history, called Persians anyone coming from the southeast. This could explain why Greek history recalls the enemy as Persians. And that's actually kind of a common situation to where cultures will retain a name that they call other cultures down the generations. And then, of course, that is going to cause all kinds of havoc with historians and chronologers who are trying to make sense of when, who was called what, when, it gets crazy. And that's one of the issues that we have. We all have this issue, by the way, and it's an issue that you never see discussed by mainstream historians or chronologers. They don't want to acknowledge, or there's no such thing as a mainstream chronology. Mainstream historians, they do not want to acknowledge this problem that they really do suffer, because it would completely destroy their paradigm if they did acknowledge it, because there's tons of this problem interwoven all over history. It's absolutely insane. All right. As for the Byzantine Empire, it is well known that the term Byzantine was used in the 16th century at the earliest and came into general use as late as the 19th century. So it is actually a very recent name. Before that, it was known as the Roman Empire. Today, it is referred to either as the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. Both names are modern. Incredible though it may sound, at the time it was actually called by many the Roman Empire. I hate this problem, and I think it's one of the things that turns off a lot of people from getting into history, and that's the problem of Rome. I hate this problem in history, and that's the Roman and the Byzantine Empire problem, because in mainstream history you have, Rome existing, and then magically, for whatever reason, Rome decides to move completely over to the east, and then there's this weird Eastern Roman Empire, but it's called Byzantine. The whole thing is so ridiculous, but basically, what we find when we look at that kind of a garbage situation that the mainstream tries to piece together to explain Rome's history, it's very convoluted and it's missing all kinds of data points. I honestly believe that a lot of people drop out of history at this point as well, because I think intrinsically most people look at the mainstream explanation with respect to Rome and Byzantium, and they look at that and they're like, this makes no sense. Like, these movements make no sense, the chronology makes no sense, the rulers make nothing about that whole Eastern and Western Rome situation with respect to the mainstream timeline, it really makes no sense. It's unbelievably ridiculous. And the fact that mainstream people still believe in this garbage and they don't question any of it anymore is insane. That whole Western Eastern Roman Empire thing, it's insane. And okay, you get it. It makes no sense. Let's keep going. The French chroniclers, for example, who related the battle from the Frankish standpoint, probably used the term Romans to name the enemy at the time, and certainly not Byzantines. Greek chroniclers, on the other hand, used the term Persians in their language and culture to designate the enemy in what is remembered today as the Battle of Thermopylae. A Greek version that we suspect was arbitrarily sent back into the deep past in the 16th or 17th centuries. A plausible scenario. Here's what might have actually happened. Only one battle ever occurred, and it took place not earlier than the 13th century AD. The details of the battle were recorded in different chronicles by different chroniclers with different viewpoints and different interests to defend. They wrote their accounts in different languages. These chronicles evolved independently in the following centuries and mythified, rendering the two stories quite dissimilar, but not completely so, as we just saw. A second possibility is that these two battles occurred consecutively in the 1200s, and some of the elements of one of the two battles, such as the number of horsemen, 300, who ultimately made the conflict tip favorably on one side, or the remark transcribed by Herodotus, ended up in the eventual popular story of the second battle. Either way, when these different chronicles were put together in the 16th and 17th centuries to create a world's chronology, one account of the battle or series of battles was erroneously sent back in time to a completely wrong epic, creating the mirage of two different battles fought in two totally different times. Again, isn't it logical to think that these two battles, despite their veneer of disassemblance, refer to one and the same battle probably occurring in the 13th century AD? And isn't it quite far-fetched, after all, to think that very similar events accidentally occurred twice in Greece with a time interval of about 1,755 years, as textbook history claims? If our conclusion is true, it means that, after reaching a certain time depth, facts written in our history books are probably mostly false, or at least much distorted, while containing small grains of truth at their core. These two battles have countless details that differ from one another, but in their general outline, they basically have very similar blueprints. Both battles have become a symbol of courage because the Greeks, who were outnumbered, ultimately either won or heroically resisted with only 300 horsemen, or Spartans in the first case, Franks in the second, warring against countless enemies. In addition, in both cases, the battle is closely associated to Herodotus. Interestingly, scholars generally agree that the version we have of Sparta is a far from the truth, idealized image, leading them to refer to Sparta as the Spartan mirage. Isn't it time for us to go further into this line of reasoning and start to label ancient Greek history as the ancient Greece mirage? Now that ends that section. Now, a couple of things I want to go over really fast before I let you guys go, because we do need to do a really fast clarification. Now, one of the things that this author admits, which is one of the reasons why I love him, or why this kind of research is being done correctly, is because he openly points out that, yes, there are details of the two battles which are completely separate. I mean, they're completely different from one another. But while there might be various details that do indeed vary from the two stories, the reality is the overarching architecture of the stories are either identical or are extraordinarily similar. So if you're going to try to throw out the fact that, well, there's still details of the battle that are different, that disproves this potential theory completely. It doesn't. Remember, these chronologers or these historians were literally making up things as they went along. And we have tons of proof of this, by the way, in all kinds of works. It's not just this particular work. The main focus, or the points that we want to latch onto, are the key features of the event. You have 300 Spartans, 300 horsemen, right? You have the battle taking place in the general area of Thermopylae. You have the exact kind of aggressors coming in from literally the exact same area in both stories. There are way too many similarities to just throw away this thesis. So as we look at these kinds of historical events, just keep this in mind. Don't forget that if you're studying ancient Greece, we really do not have a good grasp on ancient Greece at all. And I mean nothing. Even Wikipedia proves that. We just don't have the information. In fact, any of the details of the Battle of Thermopylae relative to Spartans, we don't have details, period. The only thing we can go off of is a few authors that claim that they were able to record this stuff, and then there's other authors that just base their works off of the previous authors who may not have been knowing what they were talking about either, right? So that's the conundrum that we're in with respect to history and how history is written. Okay, we're over an hour, but I hope this little section at least opens your eyes to the possibilities on how you could potentially look at history through a completely different perspective. Because remember, we have all kinds of problems in history, and a lot of the problems is simply dealing with false historical narratives. We have to start eliminating false historical narratives. Otherwise, we are never going to understand what happened in our past, and the people that currently run our society will continue to enjoy success at yours and my expense.